Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, Donald Trump wants to build a golden dome to protect America. 40 years ago, another US president had a similar idea. We'll find out why Ronald Reagan's Star Wars never got off the ground.
I'm going to be looking at the scandal engulfing the Democratic candidate for Attorney General of Virginia, and it threatens to drag the rest of the ticket down with him. But first,
President Trump began the week with an address to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, before heading to Egypt to sign a declaration he's confident will not only end the fighting in Gaza, but bring peace to the entire Middle East.
This took 3,000 years to get to this point. Can you believe it? And it's going to hold up, too. It's going to hold up.
Clearly, the billionaire businessman and author of The Art of the Deal sees this as the pinnacle of his negotiating career.
For years, long before I ran for office, that this is the Middle East. It's the biggest, most complicated deal. And also it's the place that could lead to tremendous problems like World War III. They always talked about World War III would start in the Middle East. And that's not going to happen.
Let's hope he's right. But after the mix of relief and elation that greeted last week's ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, and the joy of returning hostages and prisoners, some of the grimmer realities have resurfaced this week. Israel has already accused Hamas of breaching the ceasefire agreement by returning the remains of only 10 of the 28 or so hostages killed while in captivity. The military wing of Hamas says it's handed over all of the remains of Israeli hostages that it had been able to recover without additional equipment. Israel responded by threatening to cut the flow of aid into the devastated Palestinian territory, although reports suggest they have backed away from that. They did postpone the opening of a major aid crossing point into Gaza from Egypt at Rafah. That is in breach of the ceasefire agreement.
yeah, I think Israeli intelligence, John, believe that Hamas is capable of locating more than a dozen extra bodies, and they refuse to advance to the ceasefire deal's next phase until Hamas does so. Now, that would be news to Trump, because according to him, phase 2 begins right now. And at least according to the Egyptian foreign minister, 15 Palestinian technocrats have already been selected to administer post-war Gaza. He says their names have already been vetted by both Israel and approved by all Palestinian factions, including Hamas. So that all sounds positive, except at the same time, a senior Israeli official was denying that they have begun negotiating the second phase. The official said, "We're still in the first phase. We'll talk about the second phase when we complete the first one." So who knows what's going on there, John? I've got no idea.
Yeah, who indeed. Meanwhile, with Israeli forces pulling out of parts of Gaza, Hamas is showing no signs of relinquishing their weapons as required under President Trump's 20-point plan. And they have launched a new violent campaign to reassert control over local families and militias. There have been multiple reports of Hamas fighters rounding up potential rivals and executing them at point-blank range on busy streets. President Trump was asked about that violence, which some fear could escalate into a civil war, and he seemed unfazed.
You know, they did take out a couple of gangs that were very bad, very, very bad gangs, and they did take them out, and they killed a number of gang members. And that didn't bother me much, to be honest with you. That's okay. We had a couple of very bad gangs. You know, it's no different than other countries.
Actually, it's quite a lot different. These weren't just criminal gangs. They include powerful clans that have been a part of Palestinian politics for centuries. Some paramilitary groups have the backing of Israel as rivals to Hamas in regaining control over Gaza. But still, President Trump is expressing confidence that Hamas will be disarmed and banished from any role in governing the Strip.
How long will it take Hamas to disarm, and can you guarantee that is going to happen?
Well, they're going to disarm, and because they said they were going to disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them.
How will you do that?
I don't have to explain that to you. But if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. They know I'm not playing games, okay? Now, we did something monumental. We got the hostages back. That was the first thing we had to do, above all else.
So, Hamas will disarm because they said they would, or we'll disarm them. But how exactly that would happen, he didn't say. And his timeline for any of that happening is kind of vague too.
They will disarm, or we will disarm them. Got it? Okay.
What is the deadline you're going to put on that? You say quickly, sir. Sir, you said quickly, but what is the deadline you're going to put on that before you take action?
Pretty quickly.
Mr.
A reasonable period of time.
But for its part, Hamas says it has no need to abide by every word of Trump's 20-point peace plan, with a spokesman saying that we do not need to limit ourselves to the Israeli terms and definitions related to weapons. So if the strategy was to keep the ceasefire agreement as vague as possible in order to end the war, well, so far it's worked, but this deal is looking a little bit shaky and the future still looks grim for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are returning to live in rubble and millions of Israelis still living in fear.
Yeah, John, just over the weekend alone, Hamas apparently killed 33 people from rival groups. Actions that were condemned by the Palestinian Authority as heinous crimes that should be stopped immediately. But as you say, Trump seems pretty chilled about this all. He even suggested he'd given them permission to be doing this kind of thing. This was his explanation.
Because they do want to stop the problems, and they've been open about it, and we gave them approval for a period of time. You have to understand, they've lost probably 60,000 people. That's a lot of retribution. They've lost 60,000 people, and the ones that are living right now were, in many cases, very young when this all started. And we are having them watch that there's not going to be big crime or some of the problems that you have when you have areas like this that have been literally demolished.
But at the same time, Trump made very clear that this party was coming to an end, noting that he would consider allowing Netanyahu to resume military action in Gaza if Hamas didn't follow the ceasefire deal. And that's the last thing that Gaza needs, John. The UN estimates that it will already take 10 years just to clear that rubble you spoke of before in Gaza, and another 15 to make its farmland arable again. That's 25 years if you're doing the maths. The question is, how many of these years is Trump going to be holding those two parties together as the so-called director of the board of peace? Because Trump's already starting to hedge a bit. He's noting that he has many other commitments, and he does. It's true. It's great that Trump seems to have the measure of both Netanyahu and Hamas. That's working out very well right now. But if he's the only one who does, and then he gets bored of the whole thing, John, that could become an issue.
It certainly could. For more, I spoke to Mara Rudman. She's Professor of Practice at UVA's Miller Centre. She served in senior foreign affairs roles in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, including as Deputy Envoy for Middle East Peace. First of all, Mara Rudman, welcome back to the program. Thank you for taking the time for us.
Thanks. Good to be back with you.
As of today, how confident are you, Mara, that this ceasefire is going to hold in Gaza? We're already seeing some minor breaches of agreements when it comes to repatriation of the remains of dead hostages and some blocking of access to aid and so on. Is this enough to see the whole thing break down?
No, I don't think so. But at the same time, I would recognize that it's a fragile ceasefire, as most in this kind of situation would be. I do think, though, it's also important to distinguish you did mention concerns about humanitarian aid getting in. There's a tremendous amount that needs to get in, and a slowness in returning hostage remains. And there's been a lot of kind of public griping about it. But behind the scenes, there seems to be a steady pace of continuing to do everything possible to get the remains out and to get humanitarian aid in. I would say the additional troubling factor is the kind of gangland violence. I'm not sure exactly what the right word for it is, but it's ugly, and it shows exactly what Hamas is about. If anyone could possibly have had any questions about that they are now massacring their own people. Anyone who has disagreed with them, who has publicly taken different positions than they might have, is being slaughtered. And that obviously is also a huge problem on the ground for the many innocent Palestinians who are coping in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, President Trump, Mara, seemed to sort of brush that aside, almost sort of equating them with the kinds of gang members that you see in American cities, drug runners and gangbangers and so on. But these are people that in some cases have been involved with running militias that were being supported by Israel.
Yes, there are reports. I want to pause for a second. I found President Trump's statements on this astounding, and particularly so because senior U.S. military officials were reported shortly after he made those public statements on Tuesday, essentially taking a 180-degree position, I would say the appropriate position, in saying that this kind of violence by Hamas needed to come to an end and wouldn't be tolerated. I would also note that I know President Trump characterized those that Hamas was assassinating, targeting, committing real acts of terror against as bad actors. I think there's a certain in the eye of the beholder. Certainly some of these individuals are reported as having been part of families that were collaborating with Israel, and that's considered a very negative word in Palestinian parlance, that were working with Israel in one way or another. But also there have been a number of Palestinians, put aside any views about working with Israel or not, there have been what I thought was an unusual number of Palestinians in the last several months in Gaza willing to be quoted publicly on just how tyrannical the Hamas rule was, and how much they wanted to be out from under it. And I think any and all of those individuals are very much fear for their lives now, and with good reason. And some of them may well have been. We have very poor reporting because people aren't inside on those who have been killed thus far, and some of them may have been part of may have been among the victims of these last several days of Hamas's actions.
Does that tell us anything about the likelihood of Hamas ultimately disarming and what the implications of them not wanting to let go of at least small arms, if not heavier weaponry?
Well, I think what it tells us is what they're actually about. And again, this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. They clearly made enough movement toward, noises about the decommissioning language. And it is interesting that the Trump's 20-point plan references decommissioning as opposed to disarming. It, I think, largely means the same thing, but it was probably seen as a more palatable word in some ways. And now it's really up to Turkey and Egypt and Qatar, the countries that essentially were cornering Hamas into agreeing to this 20-point plan, to work with them to get the world to the next phase where they clearly need to give up their arms. We should also note, though, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, who sent conflicting messages, is almost raring at the bit for them not to, in that it would give him an excuse to go back in to Gaza these would be his words, to finish the job. And President Trump has made some of that, some similar characterization. So it's going to be really important both for Israel to give Hamas a chance to comply with the agreement, and for these countries who have been pressuring Hamas thus far to continue to do so, to find a path forward.
So, Mara, do you have a sense of when President Trump talks about if Hamas does not disarm, we will disarm them? Who is we? Is that Egypt, Qatar and Turkey? Is that Israel? Is that possibly the United States?
I do not believe that it's the United States. He has made, again, President Trump makes a variety of statements, and it is not unusual for him to contradict himself from one day to the other, or from 1 hour to another. Though he wouldn't acknowledge that, of course, but I think the straight words that he speaks do reflect that. And so in this case, I believe what I have heard him say is that if they do not disarm, Donald Trump, will give Israel essentially the green light to go in and finish the job. Now, he is actually not the sovereign leader of the country of Israel. He clearly wants to convey that he is all powerful, but it would be a problem across the board for Israel to go back in again. And I don't know that the disarming itself, the physical act of disarming, would be one that Egypt, Qatar, Turkey would be willing to take on or would be able to take on. I believe that getting Hamas through a decommissioning of their weapons process is itself a precursor for the international peacekeeping forces, essentially, in which those countries might well play a part. For them to be able to go in, the decommissioning process needs to be well underway.
Do you anticipate that we will get to that phase of peacekeepers and the board of technocrats and the international board of leaders, Tony Blair, Donald Trump, if he has time, or is all of that kind of a never land thing that we never get to?
I have to hope that we will be getting there, that there are people, and I don't think that is President Trump, who have been working the details of this. It was clear from the beginning that in some senses, important as it was to get all living hostages out immediately and to get massive amounts of humanitarian aid in as phase one of this plan, that was the easy part, relatively speaking, and I don't mean to make light of it. But the follow through to get to the real day after, to have the Palestinian people in Gaza be able to have houses and food, schools, and a future that gives them an alternative to Hamas, and also, frankly, leads to a pathway of a reformed Palestinian Authority working in whatever kind of partnership with countries in the region. That is where the hard work is, and that's also what's going to be most likely to get to long-term security for the state of Israel. And that's a long road, but you've got to constantly be making progress on it. I actually am reassured that Prime Minister Blair is involved in this process. Just seems to be. He's somebody who knows. I worked with him in one of his prior incarnations as the quartet representative when I was representing the United States, and some of this institution building work with the Palestinian Authority when Salam Fayyad was prime minister. I know he knows how to do the bottom-up approach, how to work institution building, how to pay attention to those details, and how to surround himself with those kinds of people. And I expect that he is working with leaders in the Gulf states to put together that kind of detailed approach. And I think it's important in that sense that Donald Trump is chairing the board. I believe it's called the Peace Plan Board or the Peace Board. So his name is on, and we know it's important to him to have his name on stuff, but it means his name is on and represents the effort. So he should have some sort of vested interest in folks continuing to do the hard work and pay attention to the details to move things forward. The region cannot afford to slide back, and the world cannot afford to have them slide back.
There's clearly a challenge in the rebuilding or the building of institutions and democratic structures and possibly future statehood. There's also the physical rebuilding task. Have you got a sense yet, given the limited access that there has been in week one for journalists and others, just how extensive a task of rebuilding and how long it's going to take with Gazans living in tents on building sites and in rubble?
So the only sense I have is from, some of, I guess, the photography that was probably done on people's iPhones, that was the on-the-ground photography, and certainly the aerial images, and it's devastating. Make no mistake about it, it's devastating. I worked on rebuilding efforts in Gaza in the beginning of President Obama's administration, when there had been, in contrast, was a much more minor, but at that point fairly devastating set of strikes across Gaza, again, as a result of Israel's conflicts with Hamas. And I know that the task of raising the funds that were necessary, about working agreements on how you could get concrete in that wouldn't be stolen for tunnels and bunkers. And in fact, we're not successful in that because the tunnel structure continued to be built after 2010. And so that is just a small picture in comparison to what is being faced now. Enormously hard, but that doesn't make it impossible. It just means, again, you have to have people who are very dedicated to getting this done from all sides, and the United States and Gulf countries in particular, and countries in Europe, and certainly Australia, I hope as well, who are going to be backing up the efforts of those on the ground.
Well, Mara Rudman, we really appreciate your expertise and thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Something quite remarkable happened at the Pentagon this week. Nearly all reporters covering the US Defense Department handed in their credentials and left after refusing to agree to a new access policy.
That new policy restricts reporter access to cover stories and says reporters could have their press passes revoked if they air or publish information that isn't authorized for release by the Pentagon.
So in very simple terms, if you want to keep your Pentagon press pass, you can only report on news that has been approved and cleared by the Defense Department. Here's how the US Defense Secretary and former Fox Weekend host Pete Hegseth justified the move in this week's cabinet meeting.
It used to be, Mr. President, the press could go anywhere, pretty much anywhere in the Pentagon, the most classified area in the world. are also that if they sign on to the credentialing, they're not going to try to get soldiers to break the law by giving them classified information. So it's common sense stuff.
Pete Hegseth basically says this is about both physical and national security and making it harder for defence personnel to break the law by talking to reporters about secret stuff.
Look, if I could just jump in at this moment, I actually spent all night messing with this story. It's the reason...
Of course you did.
Yeah, it's the reason we're not going to have a pet podcast today. But while everything you just said is accurate, completely accurate, the press generally have done a terrible job on this story. Here is how the Washington Post cited the new guidelines. Note the quote marks. The Department of War remains committed to transparency to promote accountability and public trust, the document says. However, Department of War information must be approved for public release by an appropriate authorising official before it is released, even if it is unclassified. So that there appears to suggest, John, that reporters have to get permission from Pentagon officials before publishing any information. But I got my hands on the actual guidelines, John. That supposed quote is wrong. This is the relevant part of the guidelines. I've highlighted the part the Washington Post left out. Department of War remains committed to transparency to promote accountability and public trust. However, Department of War information must be approved for public release by an appropriate authorising official before it is released by any military member, Department of War civilian employee or contract employee, even if it is unclassified. So actually the guidelines aren't talking about reporters there. They're talking about Pentagon people having to clear anything they say before they say it, which is a lot less unusual. Now, I don't know what the terms were before these changes. I'm betting they weren't that different to that. That's not to say these guidelines are good. They're not good. The guidelines explicitly say that press passes can be revoked or not renewed after only a few months if a reporter is reasonably determined to pose a security or safety risk. And that determination of a security risk may be based on the unauthorised access, attempted unauthorised access, or unauthorised disclosure of information that they don't want released. So in reality, these guidelines are a constant threat to the military press, as you said before. But I do think it's really important to note, because you would never know this from the media coverage, that the guidelines explicitly state that members of the news media are not required to submit their writings to the Department of War for approval. So I just want to be really clear about that.
Yes, indeed. And reporters, they're right when they see this as an attack on their ability to do what journalists do, which is to help hold the powerful to account, because, sure, they don't need to get pre-approval to publish, but if they publish something that the Department of War has not approved, they lose their press pass. They can go after the person who maybe leaked that information to them. Around 30 major news outlets now, including the Trump-friendly Fox News and Newsmax, are now standing as one opposing these access rules. The ball now very much in the Trump administration's court. Do they revise the rules or do they hang tough? President Trump, you'd have to say, hasn't done a great job in defending these changes. He made it clear, oh, that was Pete Hegseth's call, while also saying, but the media only has itself to blame.
And I think he finds the press to be very disruptive in terms of world peace and maybe security for our nation. Press is very dishonest. Not you, but the press is very dishonest.
Yeah, not you, the rest of them. But then he went on this riff ruminating about whether the press should be moved out of the White House altogether, send them across the road. This, of course, in the context of he's already tried to ban several individual reporters for asking questions in the White House that he didn't like. They banned entire news organisations, the Associated Press, banned from the Oval Office for failing to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America.
Yeah, look, it appears that the entire Pentagon press pack right now consists of just the One American News Network. That's a news outlet that makes Fox News look like MSNBC. Right. And the sad thing is, you might think this would bother Pete Hegseth, but I think this might be mission accomplished for Pete Hegseth. He hasn't briefed Pentagon reporters in nearly 4 months. Even his press secretary hasn't done so for 2 months. In fact, Hegseth and his press secretary have only conducted 2 press briefings each all year.
Still more than Joe Biden.
That is true. Instead, they rely on social media to have complete control over their message with no pesky questions. So in reality, these moves formalise what had been happening informally already anyway. As you say, John, maybe for the last 5 years. The irony of it is that the press hasn't been particularly poorly behaved this year. The biggest leak from the Pentagon this year by a mile has been from Pete Hegseth himself during the Signalgate controversy. But you might be wondering, what's the end game here? Well, we can see from Trump himself. The White House, as you note, has been gradually reducing access to the mainstream media this year. They've also been increasing access for bloggers and partisan outlets. And we saw an example just this week of the result of this when Trump announced that he was going to call the public holiday that was earlier this week Columbus Day, again, instead of Indigenous Peoples Day, which is what Biden called it.
In other words, we're calling it Columbus Day.
Yes.
That was the press that broke out in applause. Can you believe that? I've never seen that happen before.
A nice hearty laugh at the end too, John. That is the kind of press pack that Hegseth and the administration might be looking for, and it's pretty depressing stuff.
Sure is.
Now, there aren't many elections in the first year of a new presidential term, but every 4 years the political world's attention turns to statewide races in New Jersey and in particular Virginia. Virginia often sees a backlash against whichever party won the White House, and this year, no different. The Democrats' Abigail Spanberger in the governor's race, Ghazala Hashmi in the lieutenant governor's race, and Jay Jones in the attorney general's race, all of them enjoyed handy polling leads as of a month ago. Then things changed. The National Review got their hands on text messages that Jay Jones sent a Republican state legislator back in August 2022. At the time, a moderate Democrat, Joe Johnson Jr., had just died and he was being eulogised by people like Republican House Speaker Todd Gilbert. Jay Jones slagged him off a bit before realising he'd accidentally sent his text to the wrong person. But he kept sending that Republican more texts anyway, joking about what that, quote, piece of shit Gilbert would say about me if I died. And from there, I'm going to read out the entire text chain. He wrote, "If those guys die before me, I'll go to their funerals to piss on their graves, send them out a wash in something." The Republican responded with a stern, "Jay Jones." Then he went on, "3 people, 2 bullets, Gilbert, Hitler and Pol Pot. Gilbert gets 2 bullets in the head. Spoiler, put Gilbert in the crew with the 2 worst people you know and he receives both bullets every time." And she responded, "Jay, please stop." And he wrote, "Lol, okay. And then she wrote, "It really bothers me when you talk about hurting people or wishing death on them." She wrote that like it had happened before. Okay, now Jones was clearly joking, let's be clear here, and we shouldn't forget that. But he had really been pushing his luck to that point, given he was sending those texts to a Republican, albeit a Republican he clearly got along with. So he did what anyone would do in this situation, and he called her up to talk more about his theories. He said allegedly that the only way public policy changes is when policymakers feel pain themselves, like the pain parents feel when they watch their children die from gun violence. This is sounding less like a joke now. And then he said he wished Gilbert's wife could watch her own child die in her arms so that Gilbert might reconsider his political views. The Republican says she hung up on him then. So, what would you do in that circumstance? You'd keep on texting her, of course. Let's read what he wrote next. The Republican writes, "You weren't simply asking questions and you know it." Jones responds, "I genuinely was. I wasn't attacking you. I was trying to understand your logic." And she writes, "You weren't trying to understand. You were talking about hoping Jennifer Gilbert's children would die." And he responds, "Yes, I've told you this before. Only when people feel pain personally do they move on policy." And believe it or not, there's more. The Republican writes, "I point blank asked you more than 3 times and you dug in that you meant it. I honestly am questioning a lot today." And Jones responds, "I mean, do I think Todd and Jennifer are evil and that they're breeding little fascists? Yes." By the way, this is apparently not the first time that Jones had spoken like this to her, as she hinted in that text exchange before. According to that Republican, back in 2020, they were discussing qualified immunity for the police, and she allegedly told Jones that without the legal protection, police officers would get killed. And Jones replied, "Well, maybe if a few of them died, that they would move on, not shooting people, not killing people." Now, there's no evidence for this conversation, but you know what? I believe her. Now, that was quite a long setup, but I think it's important to know exactly what happened. Because no, Jones wasn't supporting the murder of a colleague, as conservative media and some Republicans have been alleging. But he was being a horrible person. And in any other era, he would immediately resign and people from his party would be trying to distance themselves from him as much as possible. But Jones has not resigned. He merely apologised.
A lot of politics is about trust. I can think of nothing more horrific than a mother having to hold her dying child. How can Virginians trust a man who said something so horrific, so callously?
Well, again, I am so deeply, deeply sorry for what I said, and I wish that it hadn't happened, and I would take it back if I could.
And almost no Democrats have actually called for him to drop out of the race. In fact, the Virginia Beach Democratic Committee issued a statement saying it was lined up 10 toes down, ready to organise, mobilise and deliver voters for Jay. And they added, recent press may have spotlighted past mistakes. We say, let those without sin cast the first stone. Even mild-mannered Democratic Virginia Senator Tim Kaine expressed his support for Jay Jones.
Jay has apologized. The statements that he made were indefensible, but I've known Jay Jones for 25 years. I think those statements were not in character, and he has apologized. I wish other people in public life would sincerely apologize for stuff, so no, I still am a supporter.
As for the woman running for governor on his ticket, Abigail Spanberger, she condemned Jones's language, but she also refused to say he should drop out of the race. She said that was a matter for voters to decide, even though back in 2019, she called for Democratic Governor Ralph Northam to resign because he'd admitted to being in a blackface costume once 35 years earlier. This led to a particularly awkward exchange in the governor's debate last week.
I'm wondering why my opponent won't say beyond its abhorrent and disgusting, why she won't say it is not okay and that he must leave the race because Jay Jones advocated the murder, Abigail, the murder of a man, a former speaker, as well as his children who were 2 and 5 years old. You have little girls. What would it take him pulling the trigger? Is that what would do it? And then you would say he needs to get out of the race? Abigail, you have nothing to say? Abigail, what if he said it about your 3 children? Is that when you would say he should get out of the race, Abigail? You're running to be governor.
Awkward. But no wonder Democrats refused to throw Jones overboard. The latest polling average shows Jones and his opponent are still neck and neck on 46.5% each, even after all of that controversy. It seems like party labels triumph over everything in today's politics. So I decided to talk to the person who's seen it all in Virginia, Professor Larry Sabato, Director of the University of Virginia's Centre for Politics and author of Campaign of Chaos about the 2024 presidential election. And I asked Larry what effect he believes the text scandal has actually had on Jay Jones's chances.
Oh, it's hurt his chances pretty dramatically. That doesn't mean he can't win. If the Democratic candidate for governor, Abigail Spanberger, wins by enough, and I think enough is upper single digits or higher, then she might be able to pull him across on coattails. We've seen that before, even with scandalized candidates lower down the ballot.
If this scandal had occurred 10 years ago, say, would Jones have had any chance at all, in your view?
Well, I'd like to say 20, to be sure. That goes back far enough to exclude anybody checking me. But I really don't think that the current conditions today would have been the same decades earlier, because we were much more sensitive to scandal. We were more sensitive to it in the pre-Clinton era, and then we were even more sensitive to it prior to Donald Trump. But now it's very difficult to eliminate a candidate purely on the basis of scandal, though this might turn out to be an exception.
Larry, do you think that shame has disappeared from politics completely to a certain extent?
Can you define that? I recognize the word kind of. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I think we still have a lot of guilt in American politics, but shame is pretty much out of style. Really, it's very difficult to make candidates be ashamed of what they've done enough to really reach the voters and affect their decisions. And a lot of voters have excused candidates for almost everything. Look, with Trump in office and given Trump's record, how could Republicans be too critical of any candidate with scandal, though they've tried to be in the case of Jay Jones, and they're using the recent assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk as their justification for it. And I suppose that's having an effect on some Republicans.
And are these changes purely a function of Trump's success, or are there other reasons, like, for example, the polarization of America or the rise of social media?
Those are two additional reasons, two good additional reasons. Social media has been a disaster for the tone and civility of politics almost everywhere. And I think especially here because it's just so freewheeling and people will say anything, mainly because they're doing it anonymously. Yes, many people have names on X, for example, but they're not their real names. So they feel empowered to strike out. They let the inner child, the inner evil child in them lash out at everybody they don't like in politics or even their friends and neighbors, and they're not held accountable for it. And I think it's also true that standards in our society have declined, not just because of political figures. I think it's popular culture as well. There are things I see every day on television that when I was growing up never would have reached the red pencil line of the censors that we used to have at all the networks. They wouldn't even have tried. You know, that was an era when you couldn't even refer to a woman as being pregnant. She was in a family way. A married couple on TV could not sleep in the same bed. It was ridiculous, but that was one extreme. And now we've reached the other extreme where absolutely nothing is off limits.
Now, to play devil's advocate, do you think it could be seen as a good thing that rather than focusing on gotchas and irrelevant scandals like voters might have in the past, voters today seem more concerned about what you're going to do for them?
Well, that assumes that they study the issues outside of partisan ID. And you had mentioned this earlier, I forgot to comment on it, but the extreme partisanship, the polarization today that makes it really difficult to have a conversation with anybody who's not in your party or maybe even your faction of your party is a big piece of this too. We don't listen very well anymore. We expect everybody to listen to us, but we don't listen to them because we're right and they're wrong. And that's a terrible attitude for any society.
So do you think campaigns have become less relevant than they used to be? It feels like poll numbers are more fixed in stone these days.
Yeah, it's more a question of getting known than it is of necessarily getting liked. I've said for many years that the two most powerful letters in the English language, at least for Americans, are R and D. They define most of what we do. They define who we hang out with. They define who we vote for and all the rest. So yes, I think that has a great deal to do with it as well. I wish it didn't. I wish we were back to the era when we had lots of moderate Democrats, even some conservative Democrats, and we had lots of liberal and moderate Republicans. But those days are gone, and I don't think they're coming back. I can't fill one hand with the number of moderate liberal Republicans that I know in politics, or one hand with the number of moderate conservative or conservative Democrats I know in politics. They're just out.
And have these changes in campaign standards had ramifications for the standard of governing as well?
Oh, sure. Look, again, in the old days, and the old days being even Obama and George W. Bush, you had your base in your party and you would always count on them in Congress. And most of the time they would come through. But you also had to find a certain number of people in the other party who were reasonable in your view, who would sit down with you or come over to the White House to have a drink and to talk about it. I honestly, other than 2 or 3 occasions when Trump has had Democrats over because he was more or less forced to, as he was recently with the Democratic leadership in Congress, I can't think of Democrats who go over to visit with Trump or have a meal or anything with him. It's the White House belongs to the Republicans. The leadership areas of the House and Senate belong to Republicans. The Supreme Court belongs to Republicans. And Democrats are just out in the cold.
Do you think these things go in cycles, Larry, or do you think these changes in politics could be permanent?
I would like to think it goes in cycles, but I'm more and more pessimistic. I'm worried that our republic is dying because it's no longer flexible enough to accommodate the wide variety of views in America. And you have to form coalitions to keep people together in a country, not just in a party. And that's going down the drain. We see lots of indications of this. You may or may not have followed these redistrictings taking place in almost a dozen states where the governors of a state and the legislatures in a state, depending on whether they're red Republican or blue Democratic, are redrawing the lines for their members of the House of Representatives. And Republicans have a big advantage there because they control more states and more legislatures. And they are literally obliterating the other party. In many of these states, there won't be a single member of the House of Representatives from the other party. Our system used to be built on having bipartisan coalitions. Now it is built on destroying the opposition. That is dangerous for any republic, for any democracy.
And do you have any theories about how we get out of this new direction in politics, or are you just white-knuckling this like the rest of us?
I'm going to have to be honest with you, and obviously pro-Trump people would disagree, but I don't think we have any chance of getting out of it until Donald Trump is off the scene. Even then, if a Trump substitute wins the presidency, and his views will still dominate his party in both houses of Congress, that party, that Trump party, does not permit defections, does not tolerate other views. And yes, the Democrats have also gone too far to the left. You know, the Bernie Sanders and the AOC crowd, while they certainly contribute a great deal to the Democratic platform, they also push the party too far to the left, and they're intolerant of more moderate nominees in many parts of the country. Well, you can't do that and hold a country together. Are we going to split into red states and blue states? Well, it was easy to do in the first Civil War, as devastating as it was, because it was sectional. Now you have red and blue states all over the map. I don't see any system under which we could have a federation of red and blue states where the states operate separately depending on their party.
Larry Sabato, thanks so much for visiting Planet America, and I'm sorry to bring you down like this.
No, you're extremely depressing, and anybody listening to your show will be depressed as well, and I hope you're happy.
Israel's two-year war with Hamas, including exchanges with regional proxies like Hezbollah and rival nations like Iran, again showed the effectiveness of the Israeli air defence system centred on its Iron Dome. So much so that President Trump is determined that the United States will soon have its own Golden Dome missile defence system. Although the scale is very different, Israel is only about the size of New Jersey. But Donald Trump isn't the first American president to try and find a way to shield the United States from aerial attack.
We've got a special treat for you here tonight.
I might fall from a tall building. It's just before 8 p.m. on Wednesday, the 23rd of March, 1983. American President Ronald Reagan is about to make a prime-time address to the nation from the Oval Office.
My fellow Americans, thank you for sharing your time with me tonight. The subject I want to discuss with you, peace and national security, is both timely and important.
Reagan is midway through his first term as president. Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union are at their highest point in years.
During the past decade and a half, the Soviets have built up a massive arsenal of new strategic nuclear weapons. Weapons that can strike directly at the United States.
Why don't you cook up a war or something? I'll sign on as bombardier.
We must be ready every day, all the time, for the atomic bomb.
Since the development of the hydrogen bomb in the 1950s, the United States and Soviet Russia had avoided direct conflict through a principle known as mutually assured destruction. Inevitable retaliation, making a nuclear first strike basically suicidal.
It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
Deterrence means simply this: making sure any adversary who thinks about attacking the United States or our allies or our vital interests concludes that the risks to him outweigh any potential gains.
You're reaching deep inside you.
Reagan spends the next 25 minutes discussing a proposed increase in conventional and nuclear defence spending to 28% of the federal budget. That's more than twice what it is today.
You can do it in the army.
And then comes Reagan's big announcement.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
It was an incredibly bold vision.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
That's a good idea.
Still, Reagan himself admitted it was a gamble.
I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. Yet current technology has attained a level of sophistication where it's reasonable for us to begin this effort.
Reagan's Strategic Defence Initiative was quickly dubbed Star Wars.
Huh?
And technology companies rushed to turn it into pictures, if not reality.
The first response. Space-based kinetic energy weapons fire high-speed projectiles from hypervelocity guns, intercepting enemy missiles as they are boosted through the atmosphere.
Over the next 5 years, around $30 billion was spent researching lasers and kinetic weapons.
It's time we defend our country. Under the mad doctrine of deterrence, we have no defense against nuclear attack. Under the high frontier concept of assured survival, our defense is secure.
Critics, including famed astronomer Carl Sagan, claimed not only wouldn't it work, it would be counterproductive.
It is likely to bring about nuclear war itself if the Soviets were to believe, as they say, that it is a part of an American plan for a first strike. Apart from that, it's a terrific idea.
Expert studies said the technology was simply not there and may take many more decades to come. Funding was cut and the Strategic Defence Initiative largely fizzled out after Reagan left office in 1989 before being axed altogether by President Clinton 4 years later. And yet, it may have still helped to end the Cold War. The CIA estimated that the Soviet Union ploughed $150 billion into their own efforts to develop an equivalent space-based missile defence system. Reagan's sky-high military spending, including on Star Wars, helped to drive the Soviets into economic ruin and ultimately collapse. And now, more than 4 decades later, another American president is proposing a new missile defence system, calling it the Golden Dome.
Ronald Reagan wanted it many years ago, but they didn't have the technology. But it's something we're going to have. We're going to have it at the highest level.
Although some experts say the technology still isn't there.
It is, in the end, not a feasible project.
In 1983, Reagan said it could take decades with uncertain results. In 2025, Donald Trump says his Golden Dome will be ready before he leaves office in under 4 years. I guess we'll see. And that is all for another weekend edition of Planet America. We'll see you back here at the same time next week, and we'll have an all-new episode on Monday night at 9:35 p.m. on ABC TV.
Both shows are available on ABC, IB, YouTube and Facebook. And like I said before, no Planet Extra podcast tonight. Pep will be out on Monday as well as the show. See you then.
Bye-bye.